All right, so today we are going to be talking about learning and then memory, our two topics today. These are pretty intertwined topics, right? Obviously, to learn something, you need to remember it, but I've kind of separated them into two PowerPoints. And again, these are topics I could spend, entire semesters talking about, so we'll just kind of cover some of the basics. Before we start, I kind of want to ask you to help me come up with a definition of learning. It's kind of one of those things, there's a lot of concepts in psychology. It's like you know what it is, but coming up with a definition of it sometimes can be a little bit tricky. So how would you define learning, especially for those of you who maybe haven't read the textbook chapter yet and didn't read the definition there, because you could just read that to me if you wanted to. But for those of you who maybe haven't thought about it too much, what would you say is the definition of learning? Yeah, Kel.
I'd say just like gaining new information or a new ability to do something.
Okay, so gaining new information or a new ability. So I like that. So we've got, sort of covering information and also like behavior. It could be something that you do. Okay, what would be a way to maybe tell if someone has gained new information, I guess?
Do checks on learning.
What's that? Sorry.
Do checks on learnings.
Yeah, so maybe like a test or something like that. Yeah, so that could work. Do we need to necessarily do a test to know that someone has learned something, though? Like, I don't necessarily need to give someone, like, a multiple choice test to know if they've learned something. Especially if we, let's try to think of learning not so much, obviously we're in a classroom setting right now and we're talking about learning, so it's easy to just kind of think of, formal academic learning. But you all learn things outside of class all the time, right? You learn things in an informal way where you're not necessarily given a test over it. So, what would be a way to know if someone has learned something? Let's maybe think of an example that's really not formal. Let's say you're in a relationship with someone and they maybe do something that annoys you or that you don't like, and you try to communicate that to them. How would you tell if they've learned from that? Were you going to say something, Gunnar? It's fine if it's not in response to what I just said.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you can see people, applying what they retained.
Yes.
Into, their own situations.
Yeah. So I think we got there. So the formal definition that the textbook gives is basically you have a relatively permanent change in behavior due to learning new information, or I can't remember what the other phrasing was, but basically a relatively permanent change as a result of some kind of experience. So that's what I was looking for. Typically, if someone learns something, then that is going to change them in some way. Did you have something else, Alex, or were you about to say kind of the same thing?
Change in behavior,
Yeah. So that's often, like I said, kind of the thing that demonstrates that someone has learned something is you have a change in behavior. And often, again, that can happen, obviously, outside of formal academic settings. People change their behavior all the time based on new information that they get in their relationships and their, normal day-to-day lives, in the actions that they take. If they do something and that action results in, something aversive, then they might change that action and try to avoid doing that action in the future. So learning is this process of changing our behavior due to experience. And pretty much all learning is really just a process of association. So essentially what we do when we learn is we're associating, one stimulus with another stimulus, or we're associating our own behavior with some kind of response. And those associations can be very simple or they can be very complex. So we're going to talk about basically, I'd say 4 different types of learning today. We're going to talk about simple learning. We're going to talk about classical conditioning and operant conditioning, and then we're going to talk about observational learning. And all of those really, like I said, are built on this process of just making associations between things. And this is kind of what our brain is almost built to do. Our brain is very good at this process of making associations between things, to the point that sometimes we make associations that are erroneous, that don't actually have any kind of relationship with each other. And we'll talk a little bit about, how that can lead to some interesting behaviors. So one of the main key takeaways from today is just know that learning is often a process of association. One of the things we'll talk about towards the end is something called metacognition. And metacognition is kind of this idea of thinking about thinking or learning about learning. And having those metacognitive skills can actually improve your ability to learn. So that's obviously very applicable to all of you taking this class and other classes. If you improve those metacognitive skills, then it's going to help you not just in classes, but also learning things outside of the classroom as well. So we'll talk about some of those metacognitive skills. All right, so we're going to start with some of the simplest forms of learning. And I say these are simple because, again, they're sort of, these very simple types of associations that we make. They often don't require active intent. So right now, all of you are actively intending to learn the material that I'm teaching you, at least I hope so. But a lot of learning is what's called latent. So latent learning is where you're not really trying to learn necessarily, but it just kind of happens anyways. It happens sort of automatically. And these are also considered simple because they happen in infants. They happen in all kinds of primitive species that we don't normally think of as necessarily being like super intelligent. So for example, habituation is one form of simple learning. And habituation, you can almost think of it as just like getting bored of something. So infants will show habituation if you like give them a toy or some sort of new stimulus. Usually at the beginning, they're going to be very responsive to that. They might smile, they might coo and make noises, they might reach and try to grasp it. They're very interested in like this new toy or whatever. But over time, if you, produce or show them that same toy over and over again, then basically they will stop showing that response. They won't be as interested as before. So that's called habituation, when you basically have a decrease in the response to something after repeated exposure to it. Sensitization is kind of the opposite. So sensitization is where you have an increased response to something over time. Usually sensitization is going to happen if the stimulus is something that is traumatic in some way or, like painful. So sensitization has been shown in a lot of, again, like primitive species. There's experiments they've done with like sea slugs, for example. So these slugs that are very, primitive species by all standards. And if you, for example, like shock the sea slug, it has this response where it'll like draw in, it has like a siphon thing that it'll pull inside of its body to kind of try and hide. And after that shock, it will be very sensitive to any stimulus around it. So not just other shocks, but also other things. Like if anything touches it, then it has this increased sort of fear response where it pulls in its siphon and tries to avoid the things around it. Perceptual learning is another type of very simple learning. And again, all of these, the thing that they have in common is that you have repeated exposure to something changes the behavior. So with perceptual learning, this is where you're basically just exposed to some kind of stimulus and you become better at understanding or discriminating that stimulus. So, again, another example of experiment with animals. There was an experiment where they had rats in a cage, and they had some of them in a cage in this room that was just very like barren, white walls, nothing really around them in their environment. They had other rats in a cage where the walls were covered in all these like colorful shapes. So there's like squares and circles and triangles, they're all different colors. And the rats aren't really doing anything, they're just kind of hanging out in their cage, but they're exposed to these shapes. Then later, they take those two groups of rats and they try to train them to actually discriminate those different shapes. So they have them do some sort of task where like if they pick the green square, they're going to get a food reward. And the ones who had been exposed to those shapes, they were able to learn that much more quickly than the ones who were in just like the sparse environment. So again, even though they're not doing anything with those shapes in the beginning phase, they're just kind of hanging out, they just happen to be exposed to them, just that repeated exposure made them much better at learning those stimuli. Yeah, Alex.
For my bio class, I was reading about slime molds, which are single cellular organisms. They get quite big. They can get like the big of your hand.
Right.
And there was an experiment showing that this single cellular organism without a nervous system was actually capable of learning. And how the experiment went down is there was like some kind of nutrition or food source on one end, and then it was on the other. And in the middle, there was some kind of substance coding the pathway through, like usually caffeine or salt or something like that.
Right.
And it would kind of try to reach across it, and it didn't like it. It would retreat a bunch until finally it did cross the barrier, and it would over time learn to more consistently just cross the barrier. And then other features about this creature is that it can merge with other slime molds, and when it did that, it would actually pass along that information.
Oh wow, that's crazy. So yeah, so it's like
It's a
acquiring.
nervous system.
Yeah.
It's a single cellular organism.
That's crazy. I've never heard of that. I'm gonna write that down and look into it more. So yeah, I mean, a lot of these, like I said, they're called simple learning partially because there's like these very simple organisms that can do it. I think that speaks to this idea too that we don't necessarily know exactly how learning happens, right? There's kind of this assumption that a nervous system is required because you have, we'll talk about it more with memory, but basically you have new connections between synapses is what leads to learning essentially. So then you would think, okay, things that don't have a nervous system or synapses shouldn't be able to learn, but there are plenty of cases where they do. Another one, not quite as simple as that, but there are like plants, for example, don't have a nervous system, at least not in the same way that we do, but they can also learn. If you think of like a Venus flytrap, it learns, you know, that basically whenever certain hairs are triggered by the fly in a certain sequence, that it should snap shut so that it can digest that fly. You know, there's other plants that basically respond, you know, to like touch. If you touch it, it'll sort of like wrinkle up and try to kind of protect itself. I don't know necessarily if those would be considered learning because I don't know off the top of my head if they do it from the time they're like conceived or whatever. But I mean, you know, they're showing a response to a stimulus, right? And you can do that even without a nervous system.
I think with the Venus flytraps, there's a very specific number of hairs that need to be triggered.
Yeah, it's like it has to trigger like 2 within 15 seconds or something like that for it to close. Yeah. Yep. Any other questions or comments about the simple learning process? Again, kind of main thing to take away from this, all three of them, the kind of gist of it is repeated exposure leads to one of these outcomes. And again, it happens latently without really any attempt to try to learn. Okay, so now we get into like slightly more complex learning. So the next step above that would be what's called classical conditioning. Classical conditioning you've probably heard of. This is like the experiments from even Ivan Pavlov where, you know, he made the dog salivate at the sound of a bell. But here we'll get into some of like the technical definitions that he came up with to try to describe this conditioning procedure basically. So what happens in classical conditioning basically is you have some sort of stimulus that the person or the animal, in most of the experiments Pavlov did was with dogs, you have some kind of stimulus that they naturally respond to. So, you know, any animal, if they see food, they're immediately going to salivate, and they're going to want to eat that food as long as they're hungry, right? So we call that stimulus an unconditioned stimulus. So that's the stimulus that it just naturally has a response to. And then what we can do is we can pair that unconditioned stimulus with a neutral stimulus. So something that the dog doesn't really necessarily care about or normally respond to. So in Pavlov's experiments, he had a bell that he would ring every time it was time for the dogs to eat. So he would pour the food in the bowl, he would ring the bell, and then the dogs knew that they could come and eat, okay? So normally if you ring a bell, a dog is not going to salivate to that. They're not going to have any kind of response. It's just a bell, right? But if over time, if you're pairing those two, you're pairing the food and the bell, then what will eventually happen is that the dog will now salivate at the sound of the bell, even when the food is not there, okay? So that's the process of conditioning, is building that association between the unconditioned stimulus, which is the food, and the neutral stimulus, which is the bell. And then after all that's happened, we call the bell, or, you know, in the picture it's showing a whistle, we call that the conditioned stimulus, because now the dog has been conditioned to salivate, you know, to the bell. A couple things to note about classical conditioning that you'll see is kind of different from what we'll talk about on the next slide. So in classical conditioning, the animal is fairly passive. They're not necessarily like doing anything, you know, other than the response, which is salivating, but that's something they do naturally. It's not something that they necessarily like try to do, okay? So that's one thing to keep in mind. For classical conditioning, it's a fairly passive process. Classical conditioning is something that we do all the time without even thinking about it. So even if you've never heard these terms, unconditioned stimulus, whatever, you've had experiences for sure where you have been classically conditioned. One good example would be like we all probably as kids at some point probably touched like a hot pan or a hot cookie sheet or something like that. You might remember, like maybe your mom bakes some cookies, she puts them up on top of the oven to cool down, you go to try to grab one and you accidentally touch that hot pan. Then basically what happens is like a pan, normally we don't have a response to that. It's just like this metal thing, nobody cares, right? But the pain of the heat is something that we're going to respond to. We're going to, pull our hand away and be scared of that, basically. So, if you have that association between the hot pan and pain, then now you might associate the pan itself with that pain and avoid touching it. So then you kind of learn over time, like, okay, if there's a pan on top of the oven, I shouldn't touch it. I should avoid it. And you don't need to be burned or, get that hot touch every single time for you to avoid it. You just learn, like, okay, I'm going to avoid the pan. So again, something that happens all the time in our day-to-day lives without us even necessarily knowing it. Let's see, is there anything else I want to say about classical conditioning? You can also do what's called second order conditioning, or I think the book also calls it higher order conditioning, where you then, like once you have the bell or the whistle conditioned, you can now basically treat that kind of as like an unconditioned stimulus and then sort of pair things on top of that. So if the dog is now salivating at the bell, then you could also now pair the bell with something new, something completely different, and do the same process, and then they will salivate at that second stimulus as well. So you can kind of chain these over time and build much more complex associations. Okay, so that's classical conditioning. Again, that was developed mostly by Ivan Pavlov. We talked about him a little bit like at the beginning. I think the first day we had lecture or whatever, he was one of the behaviorists. All right, so then slightly more complex than classical conditioning is operant conditioning. And I will say, for whatever reason, I think I know the reason, we'll talk about it a little bit in a second. Operant conditioning is something that students get confused all the time. Whenever we start talking about positive and negative, it's gonna like scramble your brains for whatever reason. It's just like hard for students to wrap their heads around. And I think it's just because of the use of the words positive and negative. When I'm talking about this, you cannot think of the word positive as good and negative as bad. You have to dump that association from your brain and think of positive as like a plus sign, like you're adding something, and negative like a minus sign, like you're taking something away. Okay, you have to shift your brain to think that way or else this will not make any sense. So let me back up a little bit. So in classical conditioning that we were talking about previously, the organism is pretty much passive, right? The dog's just kind of sitting there getting the food, getting the bell, whatever. In operant conditioning, the organism is actively participating in the behavior, and they have to give a response before they get the either punishment or reinforcement. Okay, so in operant conditioning, basically what happens, the organism does something, and then they get either a reinforcement or a punishment. A reinforcement is going to increase the chance that they do that behavior again in the future. So if you got good grades in high school and your parents are like, okay, I'm gonna give you an allowance or whatever, or I'm gonna buy you a new car, then that probably increases your chance that you're gonna try to get good grades again in the future. So that would be considered a reinforcement. So anytime it's increasing the behavior, that's reinforcement. Punishment is going to decrease the behavior. So if you went out drinking with your friends in high school when you're not supposed to, your parents take your car away, that would be a punishment that's going to decrease the chance that you're going to go do that behavior again in the future. Okay, so again, just to reiterate, reinforcement is going to increase the behavior, punishment is going to decrease the behavior. Now, where the positive and negative comes in is whether you are applying something new or you're taking something away. Okay, so I'm just going to go through this and we'll come up with an example for each of these. So let's start. Positive reinforcement is kind of the most obvious one. That's the example I just gave. So anytime you're giving someone something good to try to increase their behavior, that would be positive reinforcement. So again, if I, give you money to do a job, then it's more likely you're going to keep doing that job. If you're a little kid and I give you candy every time you read a book, that's going to increase your chances of reading that book. So that's positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is where you are still increasing the chance that the person is going to do something. It's just that you're taking away something bad in order to make that happen. So let's say, for example, that normally in high school, maybe you have a curfew. Your parents say you have to be home by 8 o'clock every night. Okay, in your mind, that curfew is probably a bad thing. You would like to stay out later. So maybe your parents say, okay, if you get all A's, then I'm going to take away that curfew. I'm going to remove that curfew so you can stay out as late as you want. That's still reinforcement because it's going to increase your chance that you get good grades, right? If you get good grades, I'm going to take away your curfew. But because we're taking something away, we're going to call that negative. So this is where students often get tripped up, is from this negative reinforcement, because they hear the word negative, they think that's bad, and then they confuse it with punishment when it's not. So negative reinforcement, the overall result is still a good thing. Okay? Everybody with me? Feel free to stop me and ask me questions or whatever. This is also one of those things that as I'm up here saying it, it might make sense to you, but when it comes time to take a quiz or a test or whatever, the students, again, brains sort of get jumbled and you think the opposite way from what would make sense here, okay? Can anybody give me another example of negative reinforcement? Yeah.
Giving someone less chores to do.
Yes. Perfect, yeah. So if I, again, we can talk about whatever the behavior is, you get good grades, I'm going to take away your chores so you don't have to do chores anymore. Okay, good. So I think you guys got it. So taking away something bad so that it increases the behavior is negative reinforcement. Okay, so we've got positive reinforcement, we've got negative reinforcement, so then you just kind of apply the same to punishment. So positive punishment, again, would be where you're giving something new, but that something new is going to be something bad, so it's going to decrease the behavior. So let's see. So maybe positive punishment would be giving you a curfew. Okay, you failed this class. Well, I'm going to give you a curfew now. You're going to have to come home, at an earlier time or whatever. Negative punishment is where you're taking something away, but the thing you're taking away is good, so the end result is bad, right? It's a punishment. So I'm going to take away your car. I'm going to stop paying you allowance. I'm going to, whatever, take something away. I'm going to take away your phone or your video games. Okay? All right. Everybody clear on what those mean? If I could go back, if I had a time machine, there's lots of things I would do, but I would go back and get rid of these negative and positive and replace them with different words. Maybe additive and subtractive or something. They just confuse people all the time. Okay. So, but again, idea here, in operant conditioning, we're forming this association between the behavior that we exhibit and the outcome, whether there's a punishment or a reinforcement, and then that changes behavior. I think it's probably pretty obvious because I've given you lots of examples already, but again, operant conditioning is something that has happened to all of you at some point in time. Teachers do it, parents do it, spouses and boyfriends and girlfriends do it to each other without even thinking about it or knowing it. We do this constantly to try to shape other people's behavior or to have our behavior shaped by other people. Speaking of shaping, there's a technical term of shaping and operant conditioning. Basically means where you over time kind of shape a behavior by reinforcing sort of simple versions of that behavior and building up to it. So it's really easy to think of examples of operant conditioning with animals. So I have 2 dogs and I try to train them, to be good dogs, but also to do cool tricks and stuff or whatever. And operant conditioning is the best way to do that. So for example, let's say I want to train my dog to every time she comes into the house, she's going to wipe her paws on a rug or something so that she's not muddy. That's kind of a complicated behavior to try to train a dog to do. And it's not like you can just on day 1 train them okay, go wipe your paws and they're going to do it, right? So to get that behavior, often what you have to do is what's called shaping. So with shaping, I might reinforce a very simplified version of that behavior. So if I see my dog at any point, maybe they're out in the yard and they're digging, so they're kind of doing this motion, then I might pair that with a word like wipe, right? If I want them to wipe their paws. So I'll pair that with the word wipe. And so now they know, okay, doing this movement is wiping or whatever. But at that point, they're not doing it in the right place. They're doing it in the dirt instead of a rug, right? But I reinforce that over time so that they know the word wipe means to do this. And then once they get that, I might move on to the next step. Okay, you're doing this, the correct motion, but now I want you to understand that you should only do this on the rug and not in the dirt. So now I'm going to kind of step it up, and I'm only going to reinforce that behavior if when I say wipe, you do this on the rug instead of in the dirt. You see what I'm saying? So you start with kind of like a simple version of the behavior, and then you build it up to the more complicated thing that you want them to do. Again, with parenting, right? If you have a young child and you want them to learn to clean their room, if they're 4 years old, you're not going to expect them to like put all their toys away, go get the vacuum the carpet, clean the windows, right? You're not going to expect them to do all of that, but you want to teach them like, maybe let's put away a few toys and then I'll give you a piece of candy or whatever. And then over time, you shape that behavior to, you know, by the time they're a teenager, maybe they are vacuuming and cleaning the windows and doing all of it. So that's called shaping. Yes?
I think I've heard. It wasn't exactly in the context of conditioning, but one thing I'm seeing with this in my experience is, you know, a kid or anyone, you know, who's been, you know, have parents or whatever, teachers, or being part of a job and your, you know, incentives and whatnot. One thing that's really important is to try to condition for behavior, not results. So if you try to, you know, say you gave the example very early on of getting, you know, the kid a car when their grades are good.
Right.
You want to get them a car when they consistently study.
Yes, yeah,
You know,
yeah.
Sometimes, especially with negative one of the negative, the punishment types, if you're punishing for a result and not the behavior, then you're not making any progress and you're just causing a lot of pain.
Yeah, I think I haven't read anything that directly says this, but just kind of piecing together other bits of information, I would guess that if you are reinforcing the outcome instead of the behavior or punishing the outcome, then you might end up with like kids or whatever that have sort of a perfectionist complex where they sort of feel like if I don't get this outcome, then I'm going to be punished, so it's not even worth pursuing. So then you have sort of maladaptive behavior. So yeah, that's a very good point that in general with children and even with animals, you do want to be reinforcing. It's kind of like shaping. You want to be reinforcing the behavior that you're looking for rather than a specific outcome. Another thing I'll say that kind of triggered in my mind is that in general, again, if we're talking about like a parenting context or even as a teacher, you often get better, more consistent results by focusing on reinforcing good behavior instead of punishing bad behavior. So like, let's say, for example, again, you have a kid and you want them to keep their room clean. And let's say you walk in there one day and their room is just like covered with Legos and it's a disaster and a mess, right? And so you think, okay, I'm going to punish them. I'm going to take away their favorite toy or whatever. Then they might learn like, okay, I shouldn't leave Legos on the floor. But there's like a million other possibilities of behavior, right? They could leave clothes on the floor. They could leave food wrappers on the floor or whatever. So by punishing them, you've only taught them don't leave Legos on the floor. But if you reward them for cleaning, then you're rewarding a very specific behavior and it's very clear, like, okay, I should clean my room rather than I shouldn't leave specifically Legos on the floor. Does that make sense? So in general, in again, like parenting, coaching, teaching, anything you can think of where you have like a person trying to shape another person's behavior, reinforcement tends to give you more consistent results than punishment. Another thing I'll mention, because it's just sort of coming up in my brain as I'm talking about this, sometimes when I talk about conditioning to people, it almost sounds like manipulation a little bit. Do any of you kind of get that vibe from it? It's almost like I'm talking about shaping another person's behavior. It's kind of almost like you're, trying to manipulate someone. And I would say there are certainly cases where this can be taken to a nefarious perspective and used, for that. But in general, again, almost all the learning that we do is going to be either through classical conditioning or operant conditioning. Like just as humans, that's how we function, that's how we learn. And so as long as it's used in a way where you have the other person's best interests in mind, then I would say it's not manipulation, it's just teaching. You're just teaching a child or a student or an athlete or whatever how to function better. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Another thing too to think about, if you ever are intentionally trying to utilize this to shape an animal's behavior or a kid's behavior or whatever, is that it also matters how often you reinforce or punish the behavior. So this is often referred to as reinforcement schedules. So typically, if you're trying to train, again, like a dog, for example, whenever you're first introducing that behavior, whenever you're learning, you're teaching it for the first time, you often want to reinforce that behavior like every single time. So if you're teaching a dog to sit and it's the first week you're working with them, then every single time you say sit and they do it, you want to give them a treat. But then over time, you want to sort of taper that off to where you give them what's called a random reinforcement schedule. So instead of giving them a treat every single time they sit, you're only going to do it every once in a while, just a few times here and there. Otherwise, if you just constantly reinforce that behavior every time forever, then essentially what happens is the organism is just pursuing that treat. They don't really care that they're learning to sit. They don't care that they're learning to clean their room or whatever. They're doing it for that external reinforcement. They're doing it for the reward. And what you want in most cases is for a child or a dog or whatever to learn to do things more intrinsically, to be motivated to just do it themselves because it's the right thing to do, or things like that. So you start with reinforcing every time, and then you slowly taper off to reinforce less often, is again often more effective. Okay. What else did I want to say about operant conditioning? So operant conditioning, again, was developed by behaviorists. It was started by Thorndike. Thorndike worked mostly with cats, and he developed kind of some of the basic principles of it. And then B.F. Skinner took that and sort of elaborated on it. And I think it was actually Skinner who came up with these terms that I hate. So, but yeah. And behaviorists really thought that classical conditioning and operant conditioning could explain all of human behavior, that every single thing that we learn happens through one of these two processes. And I would say most of what we learn happens through these, but there are more complex types of learning, especially if you think about learning language, for example. That was one of the key aspects that kind of took the behaviorists down whenever they were really dominant, is because they couldn't really explain how do you apply this to learning language. Is very difficult. And so while classical and operant conditioning can explain a lot of our learning, it can't explain all of it. Is kind of the main point I'm trying to make there.